I'm Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology here at the Graduate Center, the doctoral granting campus of the City University of New York. I'm also Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, which is the host of the lecture series on Wealth Inequality. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you this evening, all of you here in the audience and also the live stream audience. Let me tell you a little bit about the logistics for the evening. As follows. After my brief introduction, Ed Wolff, our featured speaker, will come here to the podium and present highlights from his research on wealth for about 15 minutes. And then he'll be joined on stage by Eduardo Porter for a conversation about Ed's work and about wealth and wealth inequality more generally. And then we've saved the last 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. So at that time, anyone who wants to pose a question will ask you to come to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. And we'll close at 7:45, close the event on stage at 7:45. And after that, we'll invite you to visit the book table, where Ed's most recent book, which I'll return to shortly, is on sale. And Ed has generously agreed to spend a few minutes signing some books. For those of you new to the Graduate Center, let me just offer a few words of introduction, in part to lay the groundwork for our collective interest in economic inequality. As one of the largest PhD granting institutions in the United States, our community of some 6,000 students and faculty play a unique and critical role in public education in New York and beyond, and we're especially proud to rank among the top 10 institutions in awarding doctorates to students from underrepresented groups. In the last 5 years, led by the Graduate Center President Chase Robinson and now by the Provost Joy Connolly, the Graduate Center has set among its highest priorities expanding our capacity in research and teaching in the field of socioeconomic inequality with an emphasis on empirical work, high-quality data, and quantitative methods. We also consider designing and hosting public programs, such as this evening's, to be central to our mission. One of our primary goals is to contribute to and to deepen the complicated national and international conversation about economic inequality that has received so much attention in the recent years. I'm proud to say that the Stone Center, founded in 2016, plays a substantial role in the work here on inequality that's carried out at the Graduate Center. At the Stone Center, our intellectual core is our connection to LIS, the Luxembourg Income Study, which is a cross-national data center located in Luxembourg, and LIS is a crucial data source for comparative research on income inequality and more recently on wealth inequality. And the Stone Center here at the Graduate Center houses the United States Office of LIS. Our Stone Center team includes 6 professors, 5 of whom are here this evening, in addition to me. Miles Korak is here, Leslie McCall, Branko Milanovic, and Salvatore Morelli. Our 6th professor, Paul Krugman, unfortunately is not here. He's on an airplane somewhere approaching New York City, apparently. The 6 of us, although we have extremely diverse backgrounds, obviously, we share a longstanding interest in multiple facets of economic inequality, especially related to income and wealth, and in the policies and institutions that exacerbate or mitigate those inequalities. And something else that we share is that we're all admirers of both Ed Wolff and Eduardo Porter. So that brings me to our event this evening. The Stone Center's name honors 2 Boston-based philanthropists who support our work, Jim and Kathy Stone, and one component of our work, encouraged and supported by Jim and Kathy, has been the establishment of an annual lecture focused on wealth inequality. The inaugural Stone Lecture was presented last year here by Gabriel Zuckman. Gabriel's talk focused on his groundbreaking work on tax evasion and its consequences for economic inequality. And this evening, the second Stone Lecture on wealth inequality will be presented by our esteemed speaker, Edward Wolff. Ed has served as a professor of economics at New York University since 1979. His encyclopedic interests, reflected in the titles of his many books, include productivity growth, the information economy, retirement security, downsizing, the economics of poverty, and more. But most of all, he's known for his 4 decades of research on wealth. Ed's most recent book, A Century of Wealth in America, was published in 2017 by Harvard University Press, and critics are calling it his magnum opus. And I do wonder, Ed, maybe you'll tell us this evening if you're planning a sequel to cover your work that didn't fit into this one. So We'll ask you that later. A Century of Wealth in America is an essential history and analysis of the accumulation and distribution of wealth in the United States since 1900. The book is remarkably wide-ranging, documenting and analyzing long-term trends in household assets, in debt, especially among the middle class, and in the role of public and private pensions in the economic security of American families. And especially relevant for the theme of this lecture series, the book covers in extraordinary detail the staggering growth in wealth inequality in the United States, especially since the 1970s. Ed trains his keen eye on both the rising concentration of wealth at the top and on the worrisome persistence of asset poverty among middle and low-income Americans. And he closes the book with an analysis of the effect of the Great Recession and of the subsequent and clearly imperfect recovery on all of these outcomes. As James Ledbetter noted on the back of the book, Wolff's analysis slices through the fog, and indeed it does. As I noted, following Ed's lecture, the conversation will continue with New York Times economist Eduardo Porter. Eduardo's reporting, as many of you surely know, brings unique clarity and humanity to his analysis of the economic scene. He has recently enlightened his readers on a multitude of pressing topics, including the hazards of Trump's trade policy, the problematic treatment of data in the robotic age, the fragility of the current labor market, the slowdown in startups, and the declining American safety net. And Eduardo, we're delighted to have you back at the Graduate Center this evening. And Ed, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podium.
Well, thank you so much for that florid introduction and also for inviting me here. Though it's just a short trip uptown, it's always a delight to visit the CUNY Graduate Center. So let me begin with just some very basics. What is wealth? Well, a lot of people confuse wealth and income. Wealth is what people own and includes things like homes, other real estate, liquid assets, financial securities, pension accounts, corporate stock, unincorporated businesses, and trust funds. So that's what I'm talking mainly about today, though I'll also show some pertinent information about income trends as well. Okay, well, that's the asset side, and then from that we subtract the liability side, which includes mainly mortgage debt, consumer debt, and other debt like educational loans, which has risen very dramatically in recent years. Okay, I used data from the Federal Reserve Board, Survey of Consumer Finances, and this is a unique data set. It has a core representative sample, so which is combined with a special high-income supplement based on IRS tax records. So it gives a pretty good picture of the very top of the wealth distribution. Okay, so what's happened in recent years? Well, most notable is what's happened to asset price changes, and this will form an important part of my talk and also the analysis of what's happened to wealth over the last 15 years or so. And what we can see is the light blue line is housing prices. We can see that housing prices actually outperformed stock prices over the years 2001 to 2007. So that's one period I'm going to focus on. But during the Great Recession, 2007 to 2010, both took a nosedive. Stock prices slightly more than housing prices. And then beginning in 2010, stock prices started to rebound. You can see a big increase in the stock market, 2010 to 2013, housing prices did manage to squeak up a little bit. And then the last period I'm looking at is 2013 to 2016. And you can see stock prices continue to zoom, but housing prices actually did pretty well. So these asset price changes will form an important element in the story. Okay, so what about the evolution of wealth? And this particular chart goes back to 1983, but let's focus mainly on the period after 2000. And you can see it's a pretty steep drop-off from 2007 to 2010 in mean household wealth, and then kind of stabilized through 2013, but then it really picked up in 2016, actually exceeding its previous peak. On the other hand, median household wealth, which is more important when we think about the middle class and the average American household, took a huge drop over the Great Recession between 2007 and 2010. I'll show more details on that in a moment. But then it did come back a bit in 2016, but you can see median household wealth is still well below its peak in 2007. So mean household wealth more than recovered. Median household wealth recovered a little bit, but well below its peak. What about income? Well, the income pattern is actually different. We can see, again, there was a fall off in both mean and median income during the Great Recession. But then mean income did come back, and by 2016 was above its previous peak. Median income also came back a bit, almost reaching its 2007 level. So incomes did recover pretty much by 2016. Mean wealth more than recovered, but median wealth, which is really representative of the well-being of the middle class, still hasn't come back. This just shows the percentage change, and again, we can see this big collapse in median wealth over the Great Recession, 44%, that's huge. Mean wealth was down by only 16%, it was still down, but not nearly as much. And then, as I noted, mean wealth more than fully recovered, and median wealth did have some rebound, but again, was still below its previous peak in 2007. Also noteworthy that wealth is distributed much more unequally than income. If you just look at the share of the top 1% on the left, you can see a much higher share for wealth, almost 40% share, than of income, about 22%. So wealth is much more unequal than income. And this shows a time series on inequality trends. So I use what's called the Gini coefficient for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's an index that goes from 0 to 1, 1 being absolute inequality and 0 being perfect equality. And you can see both have trended upward. Wealth inequality took a jump during the 1980s, stabilized pretty much, but then over the Great Recession really took another huge jump. And then moderately increased through 2016, but still by 2016 it was at its highest level in over 50 years. Income inequality, slightly different story. It actually declined over the Great Recession, 2007 to 2010, but then it really spiked upwards after that. Again, reaching its peak level in over 50 years by 2016. And this just shows a little bit more detail. You can see both the Gini coefficient and the share of the top 1% rising pretty steeply between 2007 to 2010. That's the first part of the graph and the last part of the graph. And income inequality, as I noted, did fall 2007 to 2010, but then came back, exceeding its previous high in 2016. And this shows up in both the share of the top 1% and the Gini coefficient. Okay, well, what's behind all this? Well, a lot of it has to do with what I showed you at the beginning, these asset price movements, and also what's happened to the composition of household wealth, because the overall rate of return on household wealth is a function both of what's happened to asset prices and also the shares of these different assets in overall wealth. So most notable here is a fairly sharp increase in indebtedness. So this shows up in both the ratio of debt to income, also in the ratio of debt to net worth. So indebtedness has been increasing over time. Another notable trend is that liquid assets like bank deposits and money market funds have been falling very, very dramatically as a share of household wealth. But these have been pretty much substituted for by pension accounts, IRAs and 401ks and the like. But now when we compare wealth composition across wealth classes, there are some really striking differences. So for example, on the left, we can see that homes form a much larger share of the wealth of the middle class, which I'm using the middle three wealth quintiles to measure. Much higher share than of the very wealthy. Correspondingly, things like stocks and mainly stocks and unincorporated businesses and financial securities form a much higher share of the wealth of the wealthy, much lower for the middle class. Another notable difference is that relative indebtedness is much higher among the middle class. And you can see the striking differences in the ratio of debt to income and also the debt to net worth. So the middle class is much more heavily in debt, and it also has a much higher share of its wealth in the form of homes. So it's much more sensitive to changes in housing prices. And this just shows again what's happened to the composition of wealth of the middle class. And again, you can see a pretty big increase in relative indebtedness, at least until 2007. On the eve of the Great Recession. So middle-class families were getting more and more into debt, mainly through mortgages, home equity loans, second mortgages, and the like. So the middle-class families were going very heavily into these mortgage instruments leading up to the Great Recession. And as a result, on the eve of the Great Recession, their relative indebtedness was actually at an almost all-time high. So now we're getting set for the collapse in asset prices, and we'll see what effect that's had on the wealth of middle-class families and also the rich. Another notable trend is what's happened to particularly the homeownership rate. And you can see a fairly dramatic fall off. That's in light blue, almost a 10 percentage point decline in the homeownership rate among middle-class families between 2007 and 2016. So there was a big divestiture of assets starting with the Great Recession, but interestingly continuing after that. A lot of that had to do with foreclosure activities, and this has resulted in a much lower homeownership rate in 2016 compared to 10 years earlier. Also, pension accounts have gone down, and stock ownership has also gone down. So there was a big savings going on among the middle class beginning in 2007. So this translates into rates of return. Okay, so how does that work? Well, when you think about investing, the key component or the key variable of interest is what is the rate of return on your investment? Now, when we look at overall assets, gross assets, turns out that by and large, the very wealthy, top 1%, had a higher rate of return on its gross assets than the middle class did. And this was true for all three periods. You can see, by the way, a big negative rate of return 2007 to 2010, and this was true for both the very wealthy and the middle class. This reflects the collapse of housing and stock prices over these years. But the rate of return did recover after 2010, but even more so for the wealthy than for the middle class. But now, what's more important is when we look at the rate of return on net worth. So remember, net worth is total assets minus debt. And again, remember that the middle class families have a much higher relative indebtedness than the very wealthy. So what happens, this is called leverage, the fact that when you hold debt, you can actually, at least when asset prices rise, get a higher rate of return on your holdings. But when asset prices fall, the opposite happens, and you get a much lower return on net worth than you do on overall assets. Banks, of course, have discovered this. That's why they like to leverage their holdings as much as possible to get this extra kick on their rate of return, at least when asset prices go up. But here we see some very striking differences. The high indebtedness and combined with the fall in housing prices led to a huge negative rate of return over the Great Recession. And this was even greater than the rate of return that the top 1% had over that period. On the other hand, in the earlier period, 2001 to 2007, and the later period from 2010 to 2016, middle-class families actually had a higher rate of return on their net worth than the very wealthy. And here again, the differences are particularly striking. So, at least when asset prices go up, the high leverage translates into a high rate of return, but when housing and stock prices go down, you get the opposite effect. You get a much more negative rate of return. So what does this all mean? Well, when you think about trends in the median net worth, which is what we're most interested in, because that's reflects the well-being of average families, it's really the combined effect of the housing price decline, the high concentration of homes in the portfolio of middle-income households, plus their very high leverage. And in fact, almost 2/3 of the collapse of median wealth over those years can be traced to this combined effect and this high negative rate of return. How much time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay. Likewise, why did wealth inequality increase so much over the Great Recession? Here too, the same factors are at play. The fact that the rate of return was much more negative for the middle than for the top wealth groups meant that that middle class wealth collapsed even more than the wealth of the very wealthy. So this net effect is to lead to an increase in wealth inequality. Of course, things turned around after 2010. The rate of return of middle class families actually went back up, greater than that of the wealthy. But still, wealth inequality continued to rise, and that's because of this high rate of dissavings among middle-class families that we just saw, particularly the collapse in the homeownership rate and divestiture of other kinds of assets like stocks and pension accounts and what have you. So that's why wealth inequality has continued to rise, even though there is a recovery in terms of the return on wealth, and that's why wealth inequality has continued to rise, though much more moderately than it did before. So I guess that's the bottom line, and I thank you for your attention.
Hi, well, wow, that's an impressive piece of work there. One thing, it brought to mind immediately the work of Thomas Piketty, who had his own magnum opus, I think, presented here not that long ago. And one question that immediately jumped to mind is, which one is heavier?
Actually, I think, is this on?
Yeah.
No, my book outweighs Piketty's by about a pound. So it's actually a better value per pound of book than the Piketty volume.
Great. Listen, well, one thing that came to mind as I was hearing your presentation just now is how the conversation about well-being and inequality and whatnot is much less concentrated on, talks much less about wealth than it talks about income. A lot of the inequality debate focuses on income, and I'm wondering whether that is not a mistake. Is there a case to be made that talking about wealth is much more important to the well-being of households, and that should be more the focus of the conversation and of policy ideas?
Well, I think both are crucial ingredients. I think wealth often gets neglected in the talk about well-being. But it's really a crucial ingredient of household well-being when you think about economic security. You know, if you have money in the bank account, own a home, this kind of thing, have pension savings, this is a crucial ingredient in economic security. And one notable trend, which I didn't really talk about today, has been the collapse of financial savings among not just the middle class, but also among lower income families. In fact, by 2016, the average middle-class family had barely enough financial savings to maintain its normal consumption for a month. I mean, that's how little savings middle-class families now have, and their bank accounts are basically exhausted. As I said before, big decline in homeownership, so a lot fewer middle-class families own their own home. And I think when you think about Trump's election in 2016, it wasn't so much about what happened to incomes. In fact, incomes came back in 2016. It was really more about their financial security, which had just collapsed over these years. So I think it showed up even in that sphere as well.
Yeah, in fact, the story that I sort of see in your chart of net worth going back through the early 1980s seems to show a story of a vast accumulation of debt in the middle and then a crash and a collapse. And I would love to hear your thoughts about, well, why this, what is underlying this trend? Why is there this vast accumulation of debt? My guess is that you start in '83. Is that the starting point of this, a process of increasing indebtedness of the middle class?
Yeah, in fact, back in 1983, the relative indebtedness of the middle class was almost the same as the very wealthy. As remarkable as that sounds. And it wasn't, but over the years, what happened, and this I think is mainly a story about income stagnation. As incomes really started wages, of course, stagnated first and then translated into very slow growth in income. So, I think a lot of families in the middle had no alternative just to maintain normal consumption, maybe increase it a little bit. To do that, they had to go into debt. A lot of it took the form of things like credit cards and consumer loans, but the major source was mortgaging their homes. And as you go through the years leading up to 2007, you see tremendous increase in the ratio of mortgage debt to home values. And so what middle-class families were doing was to use their homes as an ATM machine. They were basically extracting money from their homes. They weren't investing it in other assets because that doesn't show up in the data, but rather they were using it to basically finance their normal consumption. So I think that was the main motivation.
That's interesting, and I wonder what that bodes for the future, because because income stagnation seems to be still around with us, but now the balance sheets of these households are really in much worse shape. So do you think, what happens next?
Yeah, well, actually, there was a fair amount of retrenchment, starting with the Great Recession. So, particularly at mortgage debt, of course, a lot of that was indirect. When a lot of that was due to home foreclosures, because when you lose your home, you also lose your mortgage debt. But I think there has been a concerted effort among families in the middle to reduce their debt burden, both mortgage debt and also things like credit card debts. That actually came down at least until last few years. Now it seems to be picking up again. So.
By the way, one thing that struck me is interesting is if again, thinking back to 1983, and I'm thinking about your net worth numbers for at the median, it's kind of interesting because there's this lack of progress on building net worth is happening when there's at least changes in the pension system in this country that would mean, and my naive first thought would be that would encourage the accumulation of some assets, the move from defined benefits to defined contribution systems, the 401k system that became extremely popular after the 1980s. And yet that seems that you can't see any of that in your there seems to be no accumulation of pension assets in your data, or very, very little.
Well, I would say this, that there was a fairly big buildup in 401k and IRA type assets beginning in the 1980s. But a lot of that was what we call substitution. In other words, households were taking money out of other assets, mainly things like bank accounts and money market funds, and putting that money into their pension accounts. So, of course, there's a big controversy among economists, but I think on net, these pension accounts did not lead to, or did not lead very much to increased wealth holdings. Rather, they were a substitution for other kinds of asset accumulations. And, it makes sense because, money put into pension accounts are not taxed, or at least they're tax deferred. Eventually they get taxed, but at that, when the money goes in, it's tax sheltered. So, from a fiduciary point of view, it made a lot of sense to do that. But it didn't lead to much net addition to wealth. I think that's the bottom line.
And a corollary to this is, I was thinking about like the retirement securities at the median, and presumably, and my guess is that it in a lot of other points of the distribution is not looking at all very good.
No, I think that's a crisis that we have to contend with. I think, we used to have a very generous retirement system based on defined benefit pensions, sort of thing that General Motors used to give its employees. So these kinds of pensions were pretty solid. They're called defined benefit because they guaranteed a stream of benefits when the person retired. But these have been largely displaced by these defined contribution pensions. By the way, I should say that the last holdout for defined benefit pensions is actually the government sector. The federal government and state and local governments still have these very generous pension packages. But now what's happened is that as a lot of companies have switched to these new defined contribution plans, the onus of responsibility has shifted to the individual employee. So the employee takes on the risk, and whether the pension does well is based on what happens to mainly the stock market, which lately has been good, but you can't always count on it. But even so, on the verge of retirement, under the new system, families, particularly in the middle of the distribution, are much less prepared in terms of financial security for retirement. So they're going to get a much lower much lower stream of benefits when they retire now, than blue-collar workers used to get in the 1980s under the old defined benefit system. So I think this is definitely a crisis on the horizon.
Part of the different performance of the wealth, the net worth of the middle class compared to higher up on the distribution is a return on the assets that they hold, right? And that made me think about the American dream of home ownership. And thinking, well, we've had this policy for such a long time about encouraging people to put a lot of their assets into their homes. And I'm wondering, when I look at this, to be sure, you did have home prices performing well up until the housing bubble burst. But nonetheless, since then, it would have been a much better idea to be owning stock and some of the other assets that are owned by the 1%. So I was wondering what your thought is about this big asset becoming such a big part of the wealth of the middle class.
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, but certainly home ownership has always been part of the American dream, and a lot of administrations have pushed it. Even George W. Bush certainly was a big proponent of home ownership, and in fact, if you look at the home ownership rate during his years in office, they really zoomed up, particularly for minorities. I think Hispanics, a huge increase in the home ownership rate, and of course, the downside is that it also propagated a lot of nefarious mortgage instruments like non-prime mortgages and that
reverse amortization loans, horrible stuff.
Yeah. So and then this was one of the main components of the Great Recession and the financial crisis. Once these loans became due and the economy tanked, these loans could not be repaid. So you had, and of course they had been securitized. So you had, a lot of banks holding mortgage securities that were non-functioning, and this led to the collapse of a lot of financial institutions. And so, I guess that's a bit of a diversion from your original question, but I think home ownership does actually lead to other kinds of asset accumulation. When you look at wealth holdings and compare them between homeowners and renters, homeowners certainly do better, minus, of course, their home equity. But they do tend to accumulate other kinds of assets. So it definitely is a stimulus. But, it's not for everyone. And, particularly, Hispanic families took a huge hit over the Great Recession in terms of home ownership. Huge number of foreclosures, and their wealth is just beginning to recover. 10 years later. So it's not a no-risk investment, and in many ways, these families would have done better renting and, if they could, buying stock.
Yeah, thanks. Could you tell us a little bit more about, you didn't have much here about these differences in wealth by ethnicity and race. Are there any interesting patterns in the data? What do you see by?
Well, again, the story is very similar, and you go back to the Great Recession, and it turns out, it surprises a lot of people, but indebtedness was much higher. Is still much higher among minority groups, African Americans and Hispanics, than it is among white families. And so, in a sense, these families were much more highly leveraged on the eve of the Great Recession. And so when the housing prices collapsed, these two groups took a much bigger hit than white families did. And so you see our usual metric, the ratio of mean household wealth between racial groups. The African American to white ratio went from 17% down to 11%, and the Hispanic to non-Hispanic white ratio went from 26%. They had actually made some amazing progress down to 17%. So huge increase in the wealth and the racial and Hispanic wealth gap, which still has not recovered. Despite the rebound in the housing market, that gap still remains as high.
Well, and is the story of the growing indebtedness in these two groups, would you say, is it similar as a nationwide story that it happens? Is it an issue of income replacement?
Yeah, but I think it was compounded, particularly during the early 2000s, by these substandard mortgage instruments that came into play, non-prime mortgage loans, and that impacted the minority communities much more so than the white communities. So when the housing market collapsed, these two groups experienced a much higher foreclosure rate than white families did, and that led to this big widening of the racial wealth gap.
I was also wondering about your patterns by age, and be interested in understanding what happened to wealth, the net worth of younger Americans compared to older Americans.
Well, again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's really the same story. It turns out, maybe this is not too surprising, is that younger households are much more in debt than older households. By the time families reach 65, their debt levels are very low, incredibly low, particularly if they pay off their mortgage. But younger families, of course, they're buying homes. A lot of them now have these big educational loans that they've accumulated. So they have a much higher level of relative indebtedness. So again, when asset prices collapsed during the Great Recession, the wealth of younger families, and I mean younger under 45, collapse even more than that of older families. So you see the age gap widening dramatically over the Great Recession. But again, it hasn't recovered, even though asset prices have gone back up, and so you still have this this huge wealth gap between younger families and older families. In fact, back in the 80s and 90s, that wealth gap was not nearly as large. So younger families have really lost out relative to older families over the last decade or so.
I wanted to take a step back and think about the chart that you showed with the wealth Gini and the income Gini. The wealth Gini is so much higher than the income Gini. It's amazing. But I was thinking back to the Thomas Piketty book, and he has a grand theory of how wealth inequality evolves, right? With the rate of return to rich people's assets being higher than economic growth, we will have R is bigger than G. We will have wealth inequality rising relentlessly and kind of like as a force of nature. I would like to think, given that you've been working on this for so long, I've thought about this so much, if how your thinking of this fits within this kind of like theoretical idea, and how much you disagree.
Well, my results actually do accord with Piketty's in terms of the evolution of wealth inequality. One of Piketty's major findings is rising inequality. Of course, his data go back 100, even 200 years, and what he argues is that there's an inherent tendency of capitalism to lead to widening inequality. I get the same result just going back 50 years to the early 1960s. So there is definitely a rising pattern of both wealth and income inequality over the last 50 or 60 years in the United States. But his explanation, my explanation is different. Piketty sees it as a battle between the average rate of return on household wealth, which is something he calls R, and the overall growth rate of the economy, what he calls G. So as long as R is greater than G, he finds, or he argues, that wealth inequality will continue to rise. That's normally the case, that R is greater than G. The rate of return on household wealth is greater than the overall growth rate. My explanation, though, is quite different. In fact, I looked at the Piketty law, at least for the 50 years I had data. And turns out that there's almost no correlation between R minus G and the change of wealth inequality over this period. But what I do find, something you might call Wolff's law, is that if the rate of return on household wealth is greater for the middle class than for the rich, then wealth inequality will be stable or decline. Conversely, if the R of the rich is greater than that of the middle class, then wealth inequality will increase. And that relation does show up. In fact, there's a very high positive correlation, I think 80% between R of the rich minus R of the middle class and the change of wealth inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. So my hypothesis actually seems to work better with the data than the Piketty law does.
So we're almost going to have to open this up to questions, but I wanted to throw in one, using my prerogatives of being up here. Talking a little bit about what policy prescriptions might flow from looking at these numbers. And I know it's kind of crazy thinking about these things when we have an administration that just yesterday decided it was going to impose work requirements on the entire social safety net just after passing tax cuts for the very wealthy. But nonetheless, are there any like interesting policy thoughts about how to, deal with the horrendous balance sheets that you find in the middle of the distribution?
Well, I've argued in favor of a wealth tax, which would, and this is always very unpopular among my compatriots, which exists in half dozen countries now. It used to exist in, I don't know, 15 or 16 countries, where, you file an income tax return. Well, you can also indicate the value of your assets in that income tax return and have a separate tax on those assets. So this is like an annual wealth tax, which, as I said, does exist in several countries, half a dozen countries now, including France. And this, at least on the tax side, would certainly have the effect of reducing, overall wealth and even income inequality. So wealth tax on the fiscal side is certainly, I think, a useful mechanism to use. But I think there also has to be, public policy aimed at promoting wealth accumulation, not among both middle class and even poorer households. And, there have been experiments done with these subsidized savings accounts for poorer families, which have shown actually to be quite effective in promoting, some wealth accumulation. They're called IDAs, individual development accounts. So I think this would certainly be one step forward. And as I said, this has been shown to be effective by experiments. And I also like this idea of a birthright. Tony Atkinson, this noted economist who unfortunately passed away recently, and think about having a serious inheritance tax. That's another issue which we can talk about, but and putting that money aside into a fund which is then distributed, I guess, at start among children. You would do it for newborns eventually, only newborns, and they would be set up with a savings account as soon as they were born, and that's what this fund would be dedicated to. And you think about compounding interest and accumulation over the years. This would certainly lead to a much more equitable distribution of wealth over the long term than even the tax measures that I've proposed.
Well, great. So now I think I have to hand you over to our audience, who I'm sure has brimming with questions here.
I've come just to help recognize people asking questions. We invite you to the mics here. Why don't you tell us, each person who asks a question, tell us who you are before you ask your question.
Okay, my name is Guy Caldas. I'm a former teacher. I have one student who has made a lot of money. He's now living a life of Candide in some rural Kentucky, and he said the problem is the fractional debt. Would you comment on fractional debt? The fact that, for example, rich people who have money can lend more money than they actually have. The banks lend more money than they actually have as things, and that creates an upward flow of money to the people who are shareholders in the bank. What is your comment?
Well, yeah, this is also referred to as pyramiding, you mean? Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, when you think about the banking sector, how do they make money? Well, they get deposits and they loan out the deposits, but if they just relied on the deposits they got, they wouldn't be able to loan out enough money to really generate much profit. So basically they go into debt, leveraging this in order to augment the amount of loans they can give out, and therefore the interest they can collect. Yeah, I mean, rich families try to do the same thing, though, and businesses, privately owned businesses try to do that as well. Well, it's a way of making money. I don't see it as a bad thing. I mean, that's what the financial markets are designed to do. But it certainly does exacerbate wealth inequality because it allows these families to accumulate a lot more wealth than average families that don't have the means or the wherewithal to do that kind of pyramiding.
Interesting. One question you didn't deal with is the rising income of the very wealthy. For example, I've given to understand that the president of Aetna makes over $50 million, 14 in salary and the rest in other benefits. I would imagine that the ratio of people working for Aetna is probably 1,000 to 1 in terms of salary.
Yeah, apparently the average ratio between CEO pay and average worker pay is like 400 to 1. But yeah, this certainly is another aspect of rising inequality, and a lot of it actually is connected to the stock market. The reason why CEOs and other top executives earn so much money is that their pay is performance-based. It's tied to what happens to the stock market, and the stock market is to a large extent tied to what happens to profitability in this country. And this is again leading me on another tangent, but what we've seen is a big shift in income shares away from workers and towards owners of capital, and this is another noted trend that's also highly correlated with the rising income inequality, and this also has led to a further widening of the wealth gap between the rich and middle income families, because if you're earning very high incomes, not only can you save more than middle class families, but your savings rate is also much higher than that of middle class families. So the combined effect of a higher concentration of income plus these higher savings rates leads to further increases in wealth inequality.
Question over here.
Thank you. My name's Robert Chasen. I'm a business systems consultant. I want to clarify the difference in what you think causality versus description. That the Piketty R greater than G seems to describe the tendency, in his case 19th century, to the present, in your case last century. Just as you said, if R is greater for the middle class than the upper class, then they won't, the high earners won't accumulate it faster. You seem to have the same prescriptions, are very, very similar. Taxes on wealth, progressive taxes, the trend in a smaller number of people getting more income, all those things, less progressivity, less wealth tax, lets the people who have a lot of wealth accumulate more faster. So I'm not sure if there's a difference. Do you think the R greater than G is wrong, or it's just a different description of the mechanism and leads to the same or different prescriptions?
Well, my criticism of Piketty's laws is based just on my empirical findings. At least over the period I looked at and data I used, I don't find that it works. I mean, it doesn't correlate well with changes in wealth inequality. I think my own formulation certainly does better empirically. So those are based on empirical findings. But nonetheless, I think we both find Piketty first, and then myself, this rising wealth inequality and income inequality, and it seems to be inexorable. It doesn't, it seems to be ever increasing. And the only way to offset this, or certainly one of the best ways of offsetting this, is through public policy. And Piketty himself noted that as well, that if you want to dampen this inexorable tendency, you really, the state, the national policy really has to do something about it. It can't be left to free market capitalism to resolve this issue. Yeah, and then we both have similar prescriptions given those findings.
Thank you.
Question here.
Hi, my name is Mel Tobias. I'm a former teacher. I want to ask a question about a policy that I first came across in a column by Mr. Porter a while ago. And given the nature of the trend in manufacturing in this country in terms of jobs and the rise of robots in manufacturing, the idea of a guaranteed basic income has been floating around for a while. And while this idea that people would get a check every month because there'll come a time when, while you may want a job, there just won't be jobs given automation and so forth. So I'm asking what your thoughts are on the concept of a graduated, not a graduated, but a guaranteed basic income or universal basic income. I think it goes by both names. Any thoughts you might have on that notion?
You want to take it? Or?
I'll just pass it on to you in a second. The column that you're referring to, I was rather skeptical about this idea on a couple of grounds. First, I don't think that the evidence out there is that we're going to run out of jobs anytime soon, in the next decade or in the next 2 decades. I mean, I think we are overstating what artificial intelligence and these IT systems can do. I think that we have an issue of low quality jobs, not an issue of no jobs. And so to my mind, the more productive avenue for policy experimentation and discussion is to how to make bad jobs good, or perhaps how to supplement incomes of people, but not necessarily do away with the labor market, which is what I what I see the proposal for universal basic income that come out of Silicon Valley seem to suggest, that the labor market, ceases to be relevant. And so we need this other thing. I don't know if you want to give it a shot.
Yeah, I think, well, this was an idea, I don't know what first proposed, but certainly an idea proposed by Milton Friedman back in the 1950s, which he referred to as a negative income tax, that people with incomes below a certain level would basically receive a subsidy that would bring it up to this minimum floor. I think I myself would be in favor of such a system. I think there are a lot of holes in the labor market in this country, and we can't always rely on that to provide adequate income to everyone. And there are lots of reasons why people can't work. We do have a plethora of programs now providing some income support, but they tend to be pretty minimal. I mean, like, our welfare system, temporary assistance to needy families, the income support is very, very minimal. I mean, it's barely enough to get a family above half the poverty line, if that much. So, I like the idea of having this universal basic support. I think that's necessary to have a minimal level of well-being in this country for everyone. And a lot of European countries basically have this system, in other guises. Particularly Scandinavian countries basically guarantee this minimum income through their transfer programs. So I'm all for it. I think it's a great idea.
We have time for one last question. If the question is short and the answer is short, we'll be on time.
Thank you. My name's Steve Mallon. I'm global investment strategist for a large Wall Street firm, a former professor in the City University for a quarter century, and a PhD from this wonderful school. So thank you. Professor Wolff, thank you for your work. I just wonder if you would clarify something for us. If, in fact, much of the wealth inequality that has expanded is due to asset prices that have risen disproportionately for higher income people, it did not come off the brow of lower income people who might have been workers. So what's the problem?
Ed, can you answer that in 1 minute?
Well, I think it's really a philosophical issue. I mean, if you want a fair and just society, I think you really have to have a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. But I'm not saying that the wealthy have gained their wealth by taking away from the middle class or rich. I'm not saying that, but I think still societies with a more equitable distribution, for whatever reason, it doesn't have to, for whatever reason, tend to be better places to live, and people are better off. I think that's really the bottom line, is that if we want society where more people are better off, have a higher standard of living, greater well-being, then you have to have a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. And that, to me, is the reason.
Thank you.
Well, that raised our spirits, I think. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.